Good morning. Thank you for the great introduction. I am indeed Julie Birkholz. I'm Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities at the Ghent Centre for Digital Humanities, but also the lead of KBR, the Royal Library of Belgium's Digital Research Lab, which is working to facilitate text and data mining on the digitized collections. But I'm here today, and I'm delighted to present to you today on my experience with working with linked data, and specifically telling stories through linked open data. So I'm going to share with you today the story of storytelling with linked data. But in order to tell you that story and share these stories with you, I have to walk you through the process of actually how we as a team of experts were able to gather this information from archives and libraries on women editors in Europe from 1710 to 1920, to create a data model, to develop a collaborative relational database for the project, and to model that information as linked data, to connect it to other publicly available information, and then to develop this stories app. So I did this indeed with a team. Sven, if you could please put the link that for slide 2 in there of stories that we changed so that you have access to this app while I'm explaining it to you. This was a team of experts. This was on an ERC project of Professor Marianne van Roormortels in the English Literary Studies Department at Ghent University on the Agents of Change project. And here we work with technical experts, scientific programmers, as well as Wikidata and linked data story experts to successfully go through this workflow. And this allowed us to make this information available in an accessible way for humans and machines. And I really, if there's one takeaway that I want you to have today, is that, of course, the Stories app is great, which I hope you like navigating through it, but also that when we're making this data, modeling it in the linked data model, that we're allowing machines to be able to read it more easily, which also then affords us a whole bunch of different possibilities for accessing and understanding this information. The second link does work. It's just that this app was not built for 107 of you to access the app at the same time. So just have some patience and try logging in again. It will work for you. Otherwise, another thing I see that you may want to, no, that should be the correct link. Just, it takes a lot of time to load. It's loading 3,200 stories for you for linked data, and there are 100 of you accessing the site, which it is not developed for. It was meant for a few researchers to be on there at the same time. Again, the takeaway is that in making linked data, in modeling our cultural heritage data in this way, we're making it accessible for machines, which affords us as humans so many possibilities for making that accessible for researchers and the public. So while this We Change Stories app is loading, I would like to give you a little background on that. If it's not loading, I would recommend that you go to wechange.ughent.be, and you'll also find a link to the Stories app there. So it's another route to go in. So this is the linked data story of women editors from 1710 to 1920 in Europe. And it was during this time that women's access to public life and political power and decision-making was limited. Women were often excluded from formal education. They lacked many fundamental legal, political, and financial rights, most notably the right to vote. And in the We Change project, we worked to reveal that the print medium of the periodical offered women an alternative means to make their voices heard beyond their immediate sphere of influence. And they did this by being editors of periodicals. Women were able to establish transnational networks of intellectual exchange across Europe, engage in cultural transfer, position themselves in the contemporary debate in a new way. And core to this project is making the stories of these people and places and this history more widely known. And thus ensuring that this information is publicly accessible is a core goal of this for further use of researchers and the public. So here in the Stories app, which I hope some of you have been able to access now, if not, we will troubleshoot that in a moment, is you can go through stories of 300 editors that we have considered in the WeChange research project. What you're viewing is linked data from the starting point of individuals, and then lots of information that either we as the team have compiled, but also that's publicly available on Wikidata or elsewhere on the web. So we're bringing together an entrance point for researchers where they can either search for the name of the individual, which you can do right above. There's a small little search bar where you can search for a specific editor, and otherwise just going through these stories like someone would read a bibliography. Of course, though, these are not the bibliographies that we traditionally, as a human, would think we would be reading as a scholar, but stories that a machine put together for us. These are linked open data stories. So today, I'm going to walk you through how we got to this end result of this app and give you an under the hood look at the work, the diverse expertise that was necessary to model linked data and this information, and tell the stories that we want to tell with the help of computers to make our data, this information in our archives, in our libraries, come alive. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Anne. Thank you. I did not do this myself, as I said, so in order to develop this and any linked data project, you need a team of experts. These experts include collection experts, researchers with specific expertise on specific places, time periods, peoples, organizations, technical experts, scientific programmers for exporting information from different databases for joining data and reorganizing this information, linked data experts, or in our case specifically, Wikidata experts that had knowledge about this specific linked data model that we were going to use and the technical and social processes that are inherent to Wikidata. And also the role that I served as, which was a moderator or a broker, which was the in-between translating the goals of the project, of the knowledge between the collection experts and how that could technically be modeled overall. And this is important. So I'll give you one example of why. So we had in this database information on Russian editors in a period between 1740s to 1867, when the Russian Empire used the Julian calendar instead of the Georgian calendar. Well, how should we rectify this? Because in our data model, we had noted everything in the Georgian calendar. So luckily, people have encountered this before. There was lots of documentation about how we should consider that, not only for Wikidata as a model, but how we could develop some triples, so some information of linking this information and this knowledge together. But we couldn't have done that if we didn't have the expertise of the collection experts to note that to us that there was an error, and the technical expertise to help us find a solution for retaining that information. So that's really, really important that all of these people were at the table during this modeling of the data. Sven, if you could please put, sorry, I don't have another link there actually, apologies. Next slide, please. So as librarians, collection managers, cultural heritage experts, and researchers, we are constantly confronted with information, and not only how to make sense of it in our human mind, but also to easily be able to reference, structure, organize, and recall it with the help of computers. Next slide, please. In the Agents of Change project, or WeChange, we were exploring the impact of these women editors and their periodicals on this process of social cultural transformation. And in order to do this, we needed the information. We needed this qualitative information about reading an entire source, but we also needed this structured in a database and organized so that we could come back and find it. We needed names of the editors, their birth dates, their places, titles of periodicals, publication dates, list of editors, the organizations that supported these, so that we could easily move, next slide please, from periodicals to editors. The next slide, please. Thank you, Anne. The next slide, please. So a human could go into an archive and say, I see this is a textual source. This is an example of a birth certificate, and I'm going to note down the birth date, the birthplace. I'm going to confirm the name spelling. Great, that's all useful information, but a different research project or a different organization may want different information from that same textual source. They may want to know something about the parent's name or the birth weight or the location of a birth. Was it at home? Was it in a hospital? So for every research project, what is important, only for every research project, for every collection. So you at the collection level, and then what we consider data, the information that we're going to retain for the computer to help us read, is what is important depends on what you're trying to understand. So we, as cultural heritage institutions, we might have broad mandates of storing as much information as we can, which means we also have, in comparison to the small research project or the large database that I'll show you today, but the more limited research question of this app, is that we had less parameters or variables that we were collecting about these editors or of these publications. Next slide, please. So on this next slide, I have the first step. So what's really the first step that we do? First is that we need to store information as structured data. So an example of this is the spreadsheet. So it is in this moment that we can say we have data. Of course, this spreadsheet could also be on paper. It doesn't need to be in an Excel spreadsheet, but it's the moment that we say, I am categorizing information, I am ordering it in some way, it is structured. And if I'm going to put it in an instance for a computer to read, it can help me to sort and organize that. And in order to do that, we need something that's often referred to as a code book or a manual or anything that can help us to identify information that we want to bring together. So we can go from noting these editors to then be able to sort them on periods, places, but also make selections and explore these relations. Next slide, please. So again, the spreadsheets are great, but we also have lots of different ways of relating and connecting this knowledge. So imagine that you have information that's related to each other. So we have to understand in the human brain that we would think about this as perhaps separate spreadsheets. I have one spreadsheet and that they're interconnected with another spreadsheet by a signifier. So here's a really simple example. You go to a store, you're going to buy something. The store wants to keep track of what you bought, what's on your receipt. They also want to update their own records, their invoicing records, or perhaps their inventory. And they also want to retain records of you as the customer. So perhaps your phone number, your contact information, so that they can reference these things together. This is a really simple example of what we might call relational data. And if we put this in a case, a container, a relational database, right? These spreadsheets are linked by one signifier. And this helps us to organize this information. Next slide, please. And then in the second step is that we want to store this into a database. So think about this as this organized container for storing data. So this allows us to structure information, although the data might not always be structured that's in there. It could be media, it could be an unstructured text that's physically in a column if we want to think of that. But it aids us in sorting and identifying patterns, considering large amounts of information and comparing and mapping different data points, like looking at average age of death or most or least common jobs during a period or trends over time. This, of course, again, doesn't have to be on a computer, but these computational approaches afford us increased velocity, volume, variety, and veracity. What do I mean by that is that we can increase the amount of information that we're able to look at, to collect and analyze. So not only the size, that in having this database and perhaps digital workflows, we're able to do this more efficiently at a quicker speed than we were by hand, but also consider different varieties of information, as well as be able to, in some ways, assess the quality and trustworthiness of this data with computational approaches. Excuse me, I have a cold. It's not COVID, I got checked. In any case, apologies for the interruption. Next slide, please. I want to bring you back a step here, though. So we know now, okay, I have to have this information from the archive. I have to categorize it in some way, and it's in that moment that I have data. I'm going to structure this information in some way in a database, put it in a container. So I'm going to go back to the WeChange project example and give you this example of this research question. So this is the start. This could be one research question. Of course, the broader project was larger, but here we identify a time period, individuals, objects, organizations, etc. Next slide, please. So how we might bound and think about these objects in our database and what we're going to be considering to model, looking just at this research question alone, is that I would like to collect specific information on women editors, or editors more generally, and periodicals. So that might be a starting point where I sit and I think with my team or with other researchers about what is the information that I could find in the archive or library about editors, about people, about organizations, and then where might I find it? So although we might do these things intuitively as a collection manager, supporting a researcher, these are things that we really need to think about, okay, which information am I going to collect? And of course, there might be potentially hundreds or thousands of sources to consider, as well as a whole variety of different information that we might want to collect. Again, going back to the example of the birth certificate, we might want to look at different variables and bibliographic information of the editors. Next slide, please. In order to make sense of this, then, we need a data model. So in this case, this is a model that would define and structure the information, the knowledge. And what's most important, of course, is the relations among it. And it is this process that we can move from the information that the human can sort through to one that the machine can help us make sense of. So here we took three, we sought to collect bibliographical information on the editors, on the periodicals, and the organizations that supported them, and collect them in a relational database where we could link items. Next slide, please. This one I have removed. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, and Sven has just put the link in there for you. This is the link to the data model that was used in the WeChange project. So again, this is from how we move from this unstructured information so that we can sort and organize it. In this data model, this was developed by Jasper Schoutstraate and Marianne van Romortel, which gives you an idea of every single specific variable, every single item of bibliographical information that we collected, and also how they're related. Next slide, please. So again, here's this image is also in the publication. This allows you to specify the relations and the properties of these items. And it also brings together a number of international standards for modeling and also authority files, which you are probably familiar with, such as the VIF and the ISSN. This is all elaborated in the paper, and I'm not going to go into details here, but I think it would be a great resource for those that are thinking about how can I even link data model or not. Think about which information is important for my collection or for the database that I want to use. This one is specific to periodicals and editors as a starting point, but there are lots of other publications that you can find online which document their data modeling process, which can be used as a resource. All right, next slide, please. So great, we have the data model. We know which information we need to collect when we go into the library, where we go into the archive. Then we as a project, we were a team of 6 researchers. We needed to have a collaborative space where we could bring all this information together. We did that in the platform of Nodegoat. So Nodegoat is a web-based data management system for relational databases or relational data, and also a visualization environment. Next slide, please. I believe I removed some of these, so this just gives you a view of what Nodegoat looks like. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. All right. Now what? So I have the data in this database. It's great. I can search for things. I can find the person. I can go back and check names. I can make notes. I know which information I'm collecting. Awesome. This is equivalent to, let's say, a catalog that we might have of referencing all of our books. So now we have, which I display here as, let's say, separate databases, but we have the data model. It's physically stored here in a database, and we're able to identify this important information. So now what? So within this project, like many libraries and cultural heritage institutions, we had the idea, and we really found that it was important that we needed to make this information publicly accessible in a way that the machine can read and identify what it is and put together this information to find new routes to our research, because we knew that there was other publicly available information out there that we could connect with, but we also knew that these stories needed to be told and this information needed to be made public. Next slide, please. So on the We Change project, we had this growing database of information on women editors and periodicals, and our goal was to make this public, but also user-friendly for non-technical researchers. So what did we do? We did a lot of trial and error. We followed a lot of workshops and trainings and talked to a lot of people, had lots of discussions with linked data experts, scientific programmers, others that were also working with author databases about authors. And I want to emphasize here that the solution that I'm presenting here is not going to be the same one for your organization or your database. The research questions are going to be different, the needs are going to be different, the financial situation is going to be different, and there's not one size that fits all. So just because we have elected after all of these conversations to share this data on Wikidata doesn't mean that you as an organization need to do that. Rather, I would be pro you having a discussion about why do we need to do it and what does it afford us and what do we need to get there. Sven, if you could please put the link here of the Wikidata and Wikibase workshop. This documents a workshop that we organized, which brought cultural heritage teams together to talk about why Wikidata, why Wikibase. We did a lot of data modeling. It was a 5-day workshop, really intense, but really, really important to have these conversations, to get these people together. And please use this if you need a model for thinking about how to have these conversations and also convincing stakeholders why they should think about different platforms or even different ontologies. Next slide, please. So after all of these conversations, we decided what we were going to do is that we were going to convert our data, which at that time we were able to export as JSON LD, and also flat CSVs that we could later relate through these shared signifiers. And that then we were going to translate that or convert that to a linked data model specifically for Wikidata. So what that means, and again, I don't think that you need to understand every aspect of the semantic web or the technical parts behind everything in order to do this. But what you do need to understand is that the semantic web is the backbone of this. So it's a way of linking information. So the linked open data model is bringing together these little bits of distributed information through a structured ontology, through a way that they can talk to each other about how they're modeling information. Such as RDF as an example. Next slide, please. So what we did was we mapped the WeChange database that was in Nodegoat that we, again, exported as JSON LD. And we mapped this to a Wikidata ontology. Wikidata, if you're not familiar, is the public open data source. And we also used Wikidata Integrator, which is a Python module which is integrated in MediaWiki API in order to upload this. All of this is documented in 2 papers. One is from a co-author, Kat Thornton, who also helped us navigate this modeling, and the other is a forthcoming paper where we document everything that I spoke about today, but the real technical details of it. So we did this, the modeling of the first data model into the linked data model of Wikidata. This took, again, about another week's time of doing an in-person workshop with experts and a scientific programmer. We went over every single data type. So for example, what is in this column that we have in our spreadsheet? We asked ourselves, what is this? What does it represent? What are the limitations? What are the options for mapping this into the Wikidata properties? Do we see any issues? What isn't right? What's going to work from the technical side? And lots of refinement. So the calendar example is one example of that. But another thing specific to Wikidata as a community, we felt that the property of periodicals didn't fit our definition. So we made requests through the community to refine that definition to make sure that these were matching up in ways. That's really unique process to Wikidata, which wouldn't necessarily be the same if you're going to have, let's say, your own Sparkle endpoint with using and mixing these ontologies. Once we were happy with this model, we started uploading it to Wikidata in small and then larger batches with the Wikidata integrator tool developed by Andro Wachmeister. This allowed us to go from these standard file types to importing into bulk in Wikidata. Next page, please. And then I also have a link here to Wikidata. Thank you, Sven. If you go to Wikidata and the Wikidata query service, you can see that WeChange has uploaded 3, well, it's not true that there are 3,665 items in Wikidata that you can also find in the WeChange database. I believe that the contribution to Wikidata was around 2,000 unique items. So that means there was approximately 1,000 items that were already in Wikidata, which we might have enriched by adding birth dates or some related items, but that there are 3,665 items there. There I just use the Wikidata query service to find these, and you then just get a list of these on the table. If you click on that link, you'll be able to navigate this now through the Wikidata side. Next slide, please. So having this information stored in Wikidata allows us to do lots of different Sparkle queries. Here's another example of a Sparkle query. So we looked at all of those items that would be in the WeChange database, and we also wanted to find images that are publicly available online. So it's bringing together these publicly available databases to help us find additional information about these instances. Next slide, please. Once we had this data modeled as linked data and specifically in Wikidata, we developed an app with the Stories IO team, which is Kat Thornton and Kenny Seals-Nutt. Thank you, the link should be in there. There should be 2 links. One to Science Stories, which was the first Stories app that was developed from Wikidata about scientists at Yale. women scientists at Yale. And the second is just about what stories we can tell on Wikidata. So these stories apps, they work to communicate information in spaces where people can discover it in context. So it creates a jumping off point for this exploration. And this is just the web app that really is leveraging this open linked data, as well as IIIF and the Wikidata knowledge base and the semantic web technologies, getting them to create this social space of these linked data stories. Next slide, please. So going back now, I hope some of you have been able to access the Stories app, which I've just walked you through. If not, I will show you here in these next slides kind of what it looks like. So what we have here, if perhaps Sven, you could try that Stories app link again for those that didn't do that, which is on slide 29. And slide 30, which is a specific link of a QID. So it's specifically linking to an editor which has an ID within Wikidata. If you could enter those two links, Sven, that would be great, because it will then allow those that to try that out. So here we have, again, the front page of the Stories app. Next slide, please. And here is a front page of an editor. This is Isabella Beaton, a very famous British editor. And if you click further on the image itself, if you could go to the next slide, please, then we can see on the left-hand side the story that we're able to tell through through this linked data. So we not only have the Wikimedia gallery, but we also have a Wikipedia page if it's available. We have a library or a bookshelf of their publications, not only of the periodicals that they edited, but also perhaps if they were an author, if they have books. We have a timeline of important dates, birth, death, but perhaps also marriage, if that's something, or periods, time periods when they edited different periodicals. Additional images that are provided as IIIF from other cultural heritage institutions. And you can scroll down to find more and more. And this is continually being updated, because as the app evolves and the requests evolve, we can add more linked data elements to this linked data story. Next slide, please. Yes, here we can see some more authorities who also have reference information about this individual. Next slide, please. All right, in conclusion, I hope that I've provided you today with a clear example of the affordances of linked open data, but also the importance of making information readable for humans and machines. They are two different goals that reinforce each other, and they need to be considered by a team of experts to match the needs of your organization and your project. But I hope that this example also empowered you to realize that you can do this, even if you don't know anything about semantic web, linked data, technologies, about modeling. It is possible, and I hope that this provided you some practical insights into some of those processes and steps, which you'll get to have your first taste of this afternoon in the workshop, data modeling workshop, where you'll get to model some data itself, which hopefully this presentation have give you some insights into what those steps might be. So thank you again for listening, and I'm here to answer any of your questions.